Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Shannon Sclafani, and I head up ULI Michigan. I'm so excited to have you all joining us this morning for the kickoff of our 2021 WLI Build Up Breakfast Networks. Welcome back to all of our lovely ladies in Michigan who have been participating in this program for the last 2 years. I'm so excited to share with you today that we have women joining us from all around North America. So welcome, ladies from Tennessee and Canada and California, Alabama, and Texas, all over the place. I am so thrilled that you are all with us today. I'm thrilled that you're going to just be able to experience this meaningful and energizing morning with us and with each other. We're going to spend the first hour of our meeting to have a really meaningful engagement with our special guest today, and then spend the last half hour of our meeting in breakout rooms so that all of you can get to know each other better and build up your network and build each other up. So I'm so grateful to have all of you here today. And I'm also grateful that we have an amazing sponsor with us today, our friend Lisa Burden with Lynchpin Legal, who is going to share with you just a few thoughts and notes about her organization. So Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, Shannon. Hi, I'm Lisa Burden, founder of Lynchpin Legal. We are a commercial transactions and strategic advisory boutique law firm advising nonprofits, startups, and existing businesses. And my particular area of expertise is complicated capital stack financing and commercial real estate involving federal tax credits, tax increment financing, and other creative forms of gap financing. I'm super excited to be able to sponsor the WLI Build Up Breakfasts this year. In particular, this one, hi, Claire, because I think that professional women need a space to talk about things that affect them, and particularly in commercial real estate, that's necessary to have, as Virginia Woolf would say, in a slightly paraphrasing, to have a room of our own. So thank you, Shannon, and thank you all for attending. I think this is going to be a wonderful series this year.
Thank you so much for that, Lisa. I'm so pleased, ladies, to be able to introduce you to this next session. We are truly blessed today to have some amazing people with us to have a conversation about having difficult conversations. And so I am so pleased to introduce to you Orlando Bailey and Claire Nelson. Claire was born and raised in Illinois and has a love of cities, has moved around, was a part of Detroit for some years, and now resides in New Orleans. She's the co-founder of the Urban Consulate, which brings people together to share ideas for better cities. For the last 5 years, they've hosted hundreds of conversations in Detroit, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Austin, Cincinnati, Chicagoland, and they encourage them to ask daring questions and imagine how to build more just, equitable, and sustainable communities. With her today, we have Orlando Bailey, who is a born and raised Detroiter. He is the Director of Engagement for Bridge Detroit, the co-founder and host of the Authentically Detroit podcast, and is the co-host for the Urban Consulate in Detroit. So welcome, Claire and Orlando. Thank you for being with us today. And I will pass the microphone off to you.
Thank you so much for having us. It's a joy to be here. And a couple of years, do you remember, Orlando? A couple of years ago, we hosted a women's dinner at the consulate in Detroit that your Deet was at, which is lovely. And it's nice to be back. Thank you. It's especially fun for me because I get to interview and dialogue with Orlando. You couldn't pick a better dude to be in a women's group.
I tried to get out of it. I'm like, I don't know if I'm the right person. I am a guest. I am a guest. Thank you for allowing me in the space.
Well, it's been a joy to work with Orlando over the last few years on urban conflict conversations in Detroit, but also Orlando, you've been hosting more conversations too with city builders and change makers across the US. And I feel like I've learned so much from you. And I feel like you're very gifted at having conversations that are both dreamy and hopeful for the future, as well as, tackling hard things that we need to improve in how we build communities and cities. And so I guess my first question, can I ask you a first question, Orlando? Or do you have an opening statement before I just?
No, before you ask the first question, I want to thank everyone here at ULI for the invitation. I did struggle with the invitation only because I think us men tend to take up way too much space, especially it being, a women's luncheon. So I was hesitant, but I appreciate you all helping me to, feel comfortable in this space. And I recognize that I am a guest. I recognize the power and the privilege that comes with me being male. And so thank you for inviting me into this space. I am excited to dig in, and hopefully we'll share some learnings and learn some things and discover some things along the way in this convo.
Excellent, thank you. Well, can we just get started, Orlando, with your story? You've worn many hats. You wear many hats today. But one thing that I think is really special about your story is that you started doing community development engagement work in the neighborhood where you were born and raised, and have multiple generations of family. So can you share a little bit about your calling in this work and how you came to it?
Yeah, it's how far can I go back? I go back 4 generations when my great grandparents migrated here or fled the South, the Jim Crow South, from the Mississippi Delta, and settled on the east side of Detroit in the Jefferson Chalmers neighborhood, a home that is still in my family today. I grew up on the east side, right off Mack Avenue on Manistique Street. It's where my grandmother resided. And I began to take a serious interest in the built environment and the development process and what that looks like in communities that have been divested in for years. I don't have a nostalgia for what the city of Detroit was, because when I was coming up, it was pretty bare around where we lived. My grandmother owned multiple lots because it wasn't a full block of houses, right? It was only a few houses. We didn't have the word blight yet, or I didn't know the word blight. It was just, open space for us to, go and play and have a great time doing it too, right? But the nonprofit that I started my career at, Warren County Development Coalition, now Eastside Community Network, was assembling land to build what is now a shopping center where my grandmother resided, where the house that I grew up in on Manistique Street. And it was the first time that I saw, these, professional looking, rich looking white folks in my grandmother's living room, talking to her and negotiating with her about the sale of her home to make room for the shopping center. And it was, for me, the first time that I was about 14 years old. I saw my grandmother operate in a space that I had never seen her operate in. I saw her operate in a space of her being sure of what she had, her knowing her price and knowing her worth, and always having an answer, especially when the question was asked, well, what do you want? She knew what she wanted, and she knew what she had. And I remember after she was satisfied with, the sale price that she was getting, the developer asked her, is there anything else we can do for you? She said, yeah, you can help me move and you can cover moving costs. And so on moving day, these developers were there with their t-shirts and jogging pants, moving boxes in from the house into the moving van, the moving truck. And for me, that cemented this interest in, built environment, because what was once my community and, where my affection is, has now become a living room and a meeting space for Detroiters, a space that Detroiters didn't have. There was no fresh food grocer in the neighborhood. There was an Aldi Foods there. There was no massive pharmacy. There was a Rite Aid there. I chair the board of One Detroit Credit Union. There is a credit union there, a financial institution. It has become a converging space for Detroiters right there on the border of Grosse Pointe and Grosse Pointers. All of them meet up in this space. And I'm happy my grandmother did it. And for me, that was really, the start that just sort of, piqued my interest in, like, how does this work? What goes on here? Yeah.
Well, and then even though you studied journalism in college, then you returned to work in community development, right?
Yeah.
Those two worlds.
It was crazy. What's so funny is, I came home. I want to set this stage. I came home to a bankrupt Detroit, right? In 2012 with a journalism degree, and couldn't get a job in the Detroit market. The Detroit market in journalism is pretty huge. And so most people don't start there, but I was not considering living anywhere else. So Maggie DeSantis gave me a job at Warren Connor. And I was fortunate enough to be able to work and practice community development and practice those skills that I learned in journalism: active listening, voice amplification, narrative, storytelling, in my community development practice and in the neighborhoods that I called home as I was growing up. It was a tremendous privilege. And, one of the things that, came up for me is, coming home and hearing and seeing the external narrative about Detroit that was permeating around the nation and around the globe of bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy. How did Detroit get here, right? And the decline and the ruin porn of Detroit, and it being characterized with, Blackness, a Black face. And then, seeing a shift happen after the election of Mike Duggan and our emergence out of bankruptcy, and that narrative changing to resurgence, that narrative changing to redevelopment, that narrative changing to up and coming, right? And seeing the faces that were associated with that narrative. And it did not look like the people that I was working with every single day on the ground, who stood in the gap when the city had no capacity, when the city had zero capacity to fulfill services. Residents on the east side banded together to make sure that services still happen for their neighbors. It didn't look like the Barb Martins of the world, who is a retired librarian and musician who purchased the lots on her block, much like my grandmother, to keep them mowed and to keep them beautiful, right? Folks were already in the business of resurging. Folks were already in the business of redevelopment. And that was a narrative that wasn't permeating. And so taking those journalistic skills that I learned and providing amplification and platforms specifically for Black and Brown folks to express that expertise and to express that power.
I love that. I want to say, if it's okay, that part of why I love you and our friendship and our ability to work together is because I was on the other side of that story, right? I was part of, I was an entrepreneur in the Midtown Detroit. I was a white person who moved to Detroit from outside of the city. I was fortunate to get a lot of positive attention for my work. And then I ended up being in the media as publisher of Model D, where we told stories of innovation happening in the city. And so over the last 5 years, 10 years, I feel like my consciousness about what you're talking about, the narrative, the reality, who's missing, who's being celebrated, who's getting resourced, who's not, has, expanded and has shifted over time. And that's, not to toot our own horn, but a lot of that is through conversation, right? That's why I'm passionate about what the consulate does, because I think sometimes just some of the missing information is that we're not proximate with each other to listen, to hear each other's stories, and to be able to unpack it over time, because some of these concepts are pretty heady. And I think what I've been pleased to see is that, oh yeah, pictures of Orlando doing his conversation. What I've been pleased to see is in the industry, right, also a growing consciousness about what you're describing. And I wanted to ask you, Orlando, like, when you think about your own journey and equitable, like principles that you hold dear for equitable and ethical development in the neighborhood that you grew up in, and also the city at large and cities in general, like what are some ideas that come to mind that might be familiar to some people in this room, but also might be new?
Yeah, I often name and interrogate my own privilege, my economic privilege, my education privilege, all of that. My academic privilege that would lead folks to believe that, I am an expert, right? And I may be considered an expert in certain things, but what my practice has taught me and what I've learned is that you're really not, you may have the academic credential, right? But residents are the experts. Residents are the experts in where they live. Residents are the experts in their experience, right? And so how do we provide platform for that expertise to be expressed, right? But how do we add legitimacy and agency to it, right? And so even through my work in journalism, my friend Kat Stafford at the Associated Press, we have this conversation all the time about equitable sourcing. So we're telling a story about something, we're telling a story about an issue. And oftentimes we like to go to universities and get an expert opinion. We like to talk to folks with academic acclaim, or we sort of cite the folks that are speaking, at the press conference, which more times than not are folks of power, are folks of privilege. But what about equity sourcing? What does the impacted have to say about policy intent? What does the resident have to say about their built environment? And we have to learn in our practices, especially in development, how to make space for that and how to hear that, receive it, and take it as expertise. You're an expert too, but the residents are experts as well, right? And so we have to learn, and there is, we have to talk about organizational readiness for something like that, right? Because with that expertise comes experience. It comes with trauma and how that is expressed, especially in a city like Detroit. And often, when I was at Eastside Community Network, I learned how to shut up. I had to learn.
That's a good skill, yeah.
Literally, just how to be quiet, because I realized that I was dealing with a constituency that, differed from my age group, a much older constituency. And imagine growing up in a city that was the mecca for Black political power, Black economic power and representation, a city that had resources and that was able to meet the needs of people, and then watching all that dissipate and go away. The trauma that happens with that. I don't know. My grandmother bought her house and it was a house on every lot. I can't imagine the trauma that she felt when neighbors were gone and houses were vacant and then demolished. So having these resources and then seeing it go away, right? There's healing, there's conversation, there's anger that also comes out, right? And oftentimes we in these professional spaces don't like to make room for dissent. and don't like to make room for trauma to express itself. But if we're going to do this work, we can't be neutral with that. I learned, I had to learn that, right? We can't be neutral to that. I can't be so hell-bent on like my outcomes that I dismiss the rich experiences that make up Detroit. We're talking about a net loss of Black home ownership. We are talking about the loss of democratic power through emergency management, where we essentially had a czar who was able to make decisions about any and everything in our city, right? You got to listen. You got to be quiet and understand that, hey, I may be the expert, but they are experts too. And in all of that trauma and in all of that listening, there is a message, there is a signal for a solution if we listen hard enough. People closest to the power, the people on the ground, often have the most innovative solutions if we listen and if we can move beyond our personal offense of being called out. And I've been called out, I've been cussed out, right? To hear that and to honor that.
Absolutely. Beautifully said. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think listening, also being open to different ways of seeing how people talk about space and place, because we're all coming at it from such different places. I know I personally came up in like if you asked me 15, 20 years ago, I was like an urbanist. Like I studied architecture and I felt very confident about what I knew about what makes good, healthy, sustainable, vibrant cities. And so much of that it's not that I've abandoned a lot of those ideas. I think I still hold a lot of them. But density as a concept that maybe I didn't interrogate 10 years ago as something that was just a positive, now is way more nuanced because I understand more of the power dynamics of that. I understand it depends on what that looks like and who's leading that and how it's being talked about, and how that whole picture. And that comes through like the recurrent dialogues that we've had over the years, right, where it doesn't all like switch on overnight. It's a learning and a consciousness that comes through listening and dialogue, so that I feel like I've benefited from. And I think the thing that I need to say, because sometimes I forget to say, is that when people are sharing their anger, it's really such an act of love, because if you think of it as learning, people don't have to share how they feel about things, or, they might not trust you to share how they really feel about things. So if you get the opportunity, right, if I get the opportunity to hear how people really feel, I feel like that's very generous of people to share. And that's my responsibility to listen and then think about integrating that into my, not just consciousness, but my work.
That's so funny because you're right. It's an act of love, but it's also an act of self-love, right? I got to tell you too that I'm privileged to be a son of Detroit. Detroit raised me, right? I had a village, and Warren Connor Development Coalition, in Eastside Community Network, is an extension of that village. I first walked through the doors at 11 years old through their youth program, and with that came this community that helped to raise me. I also didn't know that when I came back to work as a professional in 22, that I was still continuing to be raised, right? And what happened is sometimes in this learning journey about this anger that you're talking about and this act of love that you just stated, I'll get called out. I'll get my feet held to the fire in public meetings and things like that. But what would always happen afterward is the woman, the man, whoever, just took me through the ringer will come up to me and be like, I still love you though. We'll see you next time. Like, we're going to continue to show up and I love you. You keep doing what you're doing. And I was just like, it was really this this affirmation and this reaffirming of this communal, this intrinsic communal feeling that is, I think, unique to folks of the African diaspora, right? Black folks. We are intrinsically communal, where we're able to have and carry these tensions around development, around planning, and around the built environment. And Claire, I speak that same language you speak, right? I am, folks will call me the renegade planner because I can pass, but I'm not really a planner, right? But that recentering, and that recentering in love, and that correction in love is something that I've been a recipient of so many times, and it's something that I value. People don't need representatives that they did not elect. I had to learn that. I learned that. I was speaking at University of Michigan, and I said, I represent, this constituency on the East Side, and one of the ladies from the East Side got up and said, Orlando, I love you, but you don't represent me. I didn't elect you. We represent ourselves. And that was the biggest lesson for me, right? So I'm uncomfortable saying I represent anybody now. Like 5 years ago, you would have heard me saying that, but I don't say it. But I provide space. I try to provide space and conversation so that people can represent themselves. And that's what Consulate does. It allows the space, right? So oftentimes people just want to be heard. People want to be seen and affirmed. The space for people to represent themselves.
I agree.
Yeah.
Can I ask you another question about the dreaded diversity, equity, inclusion kind of?
Yeah, and then I want to ask you questions. Because
well, we have in our dialogues, we kind of we return to a lot of the same themes over and over, hundreds of conversations. We're always talking about racial equity and pretty much all of them, but we're coming at it from different angles, right? We're talking about through the lens of maybe sourcing, or in the built environment and public space. We're talking about it and how to have better dialogues across difference. We approach it from different ways and different formats across our network. But one thing that keeps coming up whenever we talk about equity in any specific industry, especially built environment, we'll hear things about, talent pipeline, right? We'll talk about everybody. In fact, I was just in a dialogue this morning where it's well, we want to diversify our office or our sector or whatever it is, but we struggle with talent pipeline. What comes up for you when you hear that? Intention to be inclusive, but struggle to do that?
So much comes up for me when we talk about.
Trigger you with that question. He knew he was
maybe a little bit, only because of where the space that I sit in and occupy, in the city of Detroit. And this, I pay attention to narrative. I'm a media professional. Narrative is a tenet of power in this country, right? And white superiority, white dominance is almost always permeated in, that tenet of power, and it doesn't want to give up power, right? And so there is, and has been, a narrative of talent drain in the city of Detroit, essentially Black and local talent, right? And my friend, mentor, and brother Marlo Stoudemire wanted to combat that in one of his last initiatives before he passed away last year due to COVID-19. Detroit Has Talent. That was his series, and he highlighted every day for 50 days talented and credentialed and amazing Detroiters with all kinds of skill sets. And so when we talk about pipeline and building a bench, there is a level of intentionality that has to come with building that bench, right? And you have to assess, and we have to do this at Eastside Community Network, assess organizational readiness, because oftentimes the talent that is needed isn't always going to be your traditional academic credentialed type talent, right? You can have that, but are you open to other pools of talent? So in ECN, one of the things that, you know, I was able to help us do away with is that college degree requirement on all of our job applications. It's prohibitive, right? I work in communities where folks on the ground can do this work 10 times better than I can. They live it, you know what I mean? And so we wanted to start hiring from the community, and we did. And it was a big lesson, both for the community members who were hired and for the organization. We had to make sure that we assessed and had organizational readiness to employ non-traditional talent and the capacity to roll with what came with that. Right, and how to honor that. And so when we talk about talent pipeline, number one, let's be intentional. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, let's not tokenize DEI. Let's not tokenize marginalized people of color, but let's be intentional, right? And really interrogate where we are organizationally to see if we're ready. Because some of us aren't ready. Some of us have to do some audits. Some of us have to do some thinking. Some of us have to do some training before we get to that point. I wish ECN, a Black-led organization, by the way, had been a tad bit more intentional about being ready to hire non-traditional talent, right? But we learned, and you know, they're still learning over there. But there is no shortage of talent. There is no talent drain. I think that we have been looking in the wrong places. And I also think it's incumbent upon industry, right, to reach back and bring up folks. One of the things, I was trained as a journalist, but I was never forsaken by community development. Maggie DeSantis held my hand throughout college, right? And then gave me a job. She never left. She never, you know, that training never left. So many people, Charlonda, you know, I can call out so many folks who reached back. And I think that is tremendously important, especially when we talk about built environment, when we talk about development in Detroit, in Black neighborhoods. You know, we have, it's almost a requirement. We can't do it without representation. We can't do it without representative talent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So can I ask you some questions, Claire? Because
Sure.
this is, I'm most comfortable asking the questions. You recently, within the last couple of years, went back to your hometown of, you know, Barrington, Illinois, which is essentially, you know, the polar opposite of Detroit. Is majority white, majority conservative place where you grew up. And you partnered locally there to start an initiative of what you guys are calling courageous conversations, right? And I've been able to take part in, just as an audience participant in some of those conversations. Tell me what you're learning. What are you learning in that space?
Thank you. Yeah, it's been super interesting because I've been like a city nerd for, you know, my whole adult life. And like I said, I studied architecture. I don't come to this work of conversations with any educational training myself and how to facilitate or how to have these dialogues across difference and about equity. And so I'm learning as we go. But one thing I'm learning is how important the social emotional inner work is to begin for some people. Now we're all on this call, like everybody is in different places and awareness and consciousness and action on these themes, right? So it can, and you know, everything is situational and contextual depending on the room of people, what the goal is. In fact, one thing I wanted to say about consulate that I feel like it is obvious to me, but came up while you were talking is one of the things I love about it is it's like independent from, offices have their own maybe DEI processes happening internally. When you go to build a building, you're going to engage in a community process that will happen related to a project. What I love about our work, Orlando, is it's because, when we have recurrent dialogues over and over again that are not with a motivation or agenda, with an outcome that needs to happen immediately after, then it's like, I feel like it's like the same thing as exercise, which I'm not good at, but like, it's like building the habits of
That muscle
listening and
memory.
talking, practicing curiosity, hearing different voices, synthesizing the information. And we've always tried to create a very like hospitable space that's more of a social environment as opposed to like another meeting, because we want it to be a space for dialogue that people enjoy and a learning experience is something they enjoy, as opposed to like a coerced, like you're going to be in this, inclusion and equity committee for this project. So for me, that's been really important learning to then do the courageous conversations, because when we started, okay, I'll just be real on this call, like all I wanted to do was talk in this community about segregation. That was my personal interest. If this gets posted, then I've just been outed for what my true motivation was, to talk in my hometown, and like you said, majority white, more conservative, about land use, about sharing resources, about how this community thinks about the future as our country is getting more diverse, and is it welcoming, and how are they thinking about inclusion and equity. But I was schooled very quickly by Reverend Zena Jacques and my partner Jessica Green, that like we couldn't just like launch into that. We really needed to do some more self-reflection and inner work. And we need to start with some basic things about how to listen, how to be curious, how to be mindful, like all of that inner work that needs to happen before you can talk about segregation, about equity, about, and I'm talking for mostly white people, right, who aren't very comfortable talking about these things. Our audience isn't a group that is necessarily chomping at the bit to sign up for a 3-day racial equity seminar. A lot of this stuff that we've been talking about is new to them. They're not, it's not like Ann Arbor or Berkeley or Evanston. And so we needed to do some of that preliminary work. And I will say, I was like the cocky person, like, I don't need all this. I just want to hop into the real stuff.
Mhm.
But it was really important to do that, because by the time like Robin DiAngelo came to talk about white privilege, by the time we like talked about the cost of segregation, people were more open and receptive to listening. And so I think it was a good investment. And we keep coming back to those themes over time. So much of this is so emotional. And that's the part that I'm learning that I didn't know when I was like, fresh out of architecture school, thinking about place and space. A lot of it really
Valuing
is.
that, and how do you put value to that? Because oftentimes we want to skip the people part, but we got to build people too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of, we don't have to put them up on screen, but I've learned a lot about the importance of frameworks for dialogues, and having why facilitation matters, why using grounding virtues and agreements and certain principles for dialogues are really important. I have definitely learned that whenever possible, having like a lot of people like, we got to talk. And I think that you can do some damage if you just launch into that without doing some thinking about how to talk, because I think you can do more harm than good if you're not like really thoughtful about how to create that, and who's leading and who's not, and who's in the room and who's not. All of that stuff takes a lot of intention. And so I've really loved following so many different projects, from On Being, the Better Arguments project that you and I participated in, the truth and racial healing and transformation work. There's a lot of beautiful open source like frameworks out there to do it yourself, but I highly encourage professional people to consult or lead this work, because I think one of the tricks with especially white people, or I'll just speak for myself, is we don't know what we don't know. And so we often need assistance identifying that.
You know, I'm glad you brought up, you know, before we start talking about spatial racism and segregation and land development, that you had to have just heart conversations first. And I think oftentimes in development, those conversations are glossed over or dismissed. Talk about how you all thought about some of these daring questions that you been asking over the last couple of years, and what has been the response from Barrington residents?
Well, what was interesting is, we started planning right after the last election, well, the previous election, right? We recognized the need to have these dialogues, and we started planning, and then that was all. We had been, doing it for a year before COVID and before George Floyd's murder. And so what happened was, I think it kind of like people who might have been tepid about it a little bit were suddenly like, whoa, now the world's talking about it. And now they had some skills to like do it in their own communities, which is amazing. Like they were equipped in the school district, in the library, and there are different groups around town to then start becoming like leaders of conversations themselves. I think in terms of how we came up with the questions, it's that's a long answer. But I do think one of the things, particularly on segregation, that I loved about how we structured that session, we invited, this is Chicagoland, so we invited the Metropolitan Planning Council to share their cost of segregation report. And one of the ways that they frame that I think is really important, and Heather McGee is doing in her new book, The Sum of Us, about what racism costs everybody, is that they actually itemized the cost for everybody in the Chicagoland region from segregation. So it wasn't just a more traditional frame of like how it's hurting the most marginalized. It was also showing the most affluent people in Barrington Hills what they were losing monetarily, but then also
wow,
also on a moral level too. Like it was a combination, because they showed how many people were dying, like how much crime could be reduced, how much the murder rate would fall if Chicago was more integrated. And to me, that was very like a jarring number, because it actually, there's like no way of escaping, oh, my choice to segregate, to self-segregate and not participate in shared resources in the region for schools and education and space and place and all of that is actually resulting in people's deaths. And so that is a thing that you have to face,
We got to get to the Q&A, but I want
Okay,
you to talk to this. I want you to speak to this right before we go into the Q&A. You said something in preparation for today around, folks who have who come to these conversations are developing, this consciousness that you spoke of. But how can and what does the process look like to translate that consciousness into practice, into habits and policy?
So part of my problem is that I'm like a fierce urgency of now person, and I'm being schooled in how to be more patient, which I'm constantly pushing back on. But I have to think about my own journey on this and how long it took for me to become more aware, and then how long it's taking me to integrate that into my work. And then like take a little deep breath when I get frustrated that like, oh great, all these people now get it, but like, what are they doing about it? And whenever I do that in my head, I have to turn it back to myself, right? What am I like, what's my journey? What am I doing? And what are my expectations for others? I think for a lot of people, it's, to be honest, like, right, you become aware, and then your first steps are not going to be, you're going to walk before you run, probably. And we're seeing that, like, for some people, we're like, oh, maybe they'll, in this particular series, we're like, oh, maybe they'll get really active in policy making around, affordable housing in the community. We haven't seen that yet. I mean, this is this is fresh. We've seen people take the next step, right, of like wanting to have more dialogues about expanding the circle of people that are talking about these things. And I think that's really important. That might be the first step. But I think we have to think about this, Valerie Carr, that talk we went to Orlando, this is a 25-year project as the demographics of the nation shift.
Yeah.
And when I think about things like segregation, and I think about land use and climate change, and I think about reparations, I have to like think in 25, 50 years. And for me, the challenge is to keep going even when it's hard.
It's not a sprint, Yeah. So, wow, Claire, thank you. I want to thank you for letting me ask you some of these questions, because you do an amazing job of giving up space for us to assume position and power. But your expertise, your experience, and your story is so valuable. And I thank you for sharing a little bit of it.
It's like the greatest gift in my life that like I'm older than Orlando by what, like 15 years or something. Like you're a great teacher to me, and like I highly suggest surrounding yourself with people who are younger, because you learn. I get to be a student. I get to listen to the conversations you host, and that's a great gift. So thank you.
All right. So Q&A. Shannon, are we doing that, or are you directing?
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say, Claire, that's a great point, because thank you for giving us the gift of being able to join in on this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Such a treat to just hear two people who genuinely love and respect each other be able to have very candid conversations. And I'm just so grateful that we were able to listen in and be a part of that. And I think I speak for everyone when I say that I could listen to you guys talk all day.
Oh, that's sweet.
Makes total sense that you have a podcast.
Yes, listen to Orlando's podcast. And I should have maybe, to be more real, modeled like the defensiveness that I like had to move through years ago to be able to like hear now, because I used to be, very like, wait a second, like let me let me challenge that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Defending what you think is right, or defending like what somebody is pointing out is wrong with, in you. I get it. Jill, it looks like you've typed up the first question in the Q&A. Do you want to come off mute and ask that? Or would you like me to read it out loud?
Sure. I'm so happy to see you both. I'm so glad to see your faces. Yeah, we just finished our urban plan program in the city of Detroit, and I know it was so meaningful for ULI members that participated. And it just makes me wonder. We talk to so many of these kids. They are leaving to go to college, they're moving on with their lives, and so many of them are just desperate to get out of the city. And it's so understandable with the the disinvestment and everything that's going on. So just want to talk a little bit about, other than investing more in the neighborhoods, how can we encourage these kids to stay or come back in the city of Detroit? How can we show that there will be hope, there will be investment in the neighborhoods? Just wondering what your thoughts are.
Hey, Jill, it's good to see you too. So many things are rushing to my mind. I'll say this. Getting to young people before it's time for them to leave. I cut my teeth in this field in youth development at Warren Connor. And it was an investment that you don't always see an immediate return on. But one of the things that I tried to do was to create a space for young people and a vision of the city that they felt like they didn't need to escape from, right? So many
Yeah.
of our young people feel like they got to escape this place. And for me, because of the village, right? Even though I was living around blight, even though I was living around vacancy, Detroit was never a place that I felt like I needed to escape from because of the village. And so number one, creating a village around young people when they're young before they get ready to leave, but also as a person of privilege and empower with the ability to hire folks, I think seeing young people seeing representation of themselves in all of these different fields and lanes is also, tremendously powerful. Young people cannot dream about what they have never been exposed to, right? And so exposure to home, right? And the tremendous opportunities that are here, and how they can play a role in providing even more opportunities and hope, especially for the neighborhoods that they grew up in. Hope is a powerful thing. Barack Obama won an election on hope, right? It really is essential. And so for Jill, to answer your question, the village, right? Representation, and exposure.
I also say, like, what do you think about, or I have a question, the power of like the boomerang? Because I feel like it took me so long to go back to my hometown and do work, but like my experience before that has helped inform me reconnecting. Like Orlando, you left the city to go to college and then came back. How do you feel about that?
Everybody, journey,
Yeah.
personal journey. And I also understand that to Jill's point, with divestment, right? And with limited resources comes trauma. And oftentimes people don't want to return to a place of trauma. It takes a while to reckon with that. And it takes a while to return, right? My hope is for everybody to return. Like I have friends in LA, Atlanta, folks who never came back in the South, Alabama. Like it's like, y'all come home. And they're reckoning with like, well, what's there? And I'm like, how can you ask that question? There's so much here. But the Detroit that they knew and the Detroit that they grew up with, it looked different, right? So yeah, hopefully they'll boomerang sometime. So, but it's a journey, a very personal one.
Right.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Nicole, it looks like you've got a question in the chat. Did you want to come off mute?
Oh, sure. Sorry, I'm driving here. Hi, so good to see you.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi. This has been, excuse my runaround appearance today. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And I just want to thank you all for having this conversation. First of all, it's something very dear to my heart. I live in the Jefferson Chalmers area. I've been here and involved in the community actively, directly with the youth, and I do make it a point to be an example for those who do as like me and have lived in the city for a very long time and may be experiencing loss of hope, as they see things change and they
We're
participate in and I'm always at the ready to provide that inspiration, to be a force. My children went to school at Timbuktu Academy, which is on the east side, just behind. It was the last loosely African-centered school just behind where Chrysler has developed now. And now they're at Bates Academy. But it's my goal to always be an example for those children that may not see people who are in real estate, people who are, doing something that they've never thought of doing, and inspire. And so I always want to be, I do like free classes in the community. I just always want to be able to provide whatever information I can and whatever inspiration and hope I can. and other resources, my time and energy? How can I, my company, my partners, partner with you all to continue these conversations? I work with elders in the community who've been there and they're seeing their properties, you know, their friends' properties going and being flipped or whatever. And it's scary for them because they don't have resources or experience. Like your grandmother, Orlando, was very savvy and advocated for what she had. So how can I support? How can I, you know, be a part of these conversations? I just want the information on how to provide my resources, whatever I can do.
Claire, or you?
No, for you.
Okay. So thank you for the question, Nicole. You know, the home that has been in our family for 4 generations is in Jefferson Chalmers, so I'm very familiar with the area. Grew up there as well. There are so many organizations, and actually Jill can attest to this too. So many organizations working in the Jefferson Chalmers community, serving, you know, subsects of the population there, youth, senior citizens, and everybody, you know, in between. And so I would, you know, audit who's doing the work and who's most aligned with your mission, Nicole, and partner with those organizations. I don't think you have to do anything new. There are organizations actually having and curating conversations as well. I'm thinking about Hope Development and Community Outreach. They have an amazing youth constituency there that work in the community as community keepers, especially, you know, in the summertime, and even, you know, sit and partner with seniors on their porches just to, you know, keep them company in the summertime. Jefferson East Inc., a really, you know, a real estate development, economic development, not-for-profit that is stewarding development along the Jefferson Avenue corridor and even inside of Jefferson Chalmers. LEAP, curated by a lot of organizations, but Eastside Community Network at the helm, is also hosting and having conversations in Jefferson Chalmers and trying to steward resources for residents there. So Jefferson Chalmers is rich in organizing, and is rich in conversations. And so I would encourage you to partner with any of those amazing and reputable organizations to, I love what you said, providing balm to help provide healing. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, necessary. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think we've got time for just one more question. Tanya, do you want to come off of mute to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks. Hi, guys.
Hey, Tanya.
This is such a fabulous conversation. This might be Pandora's box I'm opening. It's so timely. I just came from a BZA hearing. And we're work at kind of the intersection with code compliance. I'm most comfortable as a technical expert, but also community engagement is key to everything our firm does. And as excited as we are about the design bar being raised in Detroit, what I'm experiencing now with several of my clients that are working closely with the community, that now we have public sector planners that might not like the design and might not like what the community wants. And then the developer, more importantly, the architect, Claire, I think you can relate to this. The architect's like, well, who do I listen to? I want to get my project approved. But these design professionals on the public sector side want this, and that the residents have bought into something entirely different. So it's causing just things I never anticipated having to navigate. And I love, Claire, what you said, that, like you said a couple of times, you know, you're a professional architect, but sometimes you got to kind of lay that aside. And as a professional planner who used to work for the planning and development department, it's tough. So I just wanted to know if you guys could speak to that.
Yeah. I'm trying to give space to you, Claire, too. But so yeah, Tanya, I'm familiar, and I I bet it's a statewide issue. For me, and how I practice at Eastside Community Network is to question what tables are we setting and who are we requiring to show up, right? And are the right people at the table? And so given the privilege of the organization, we were able to set tables that residents led with the public sector and with developers who are coming in a well-facilitated manner to get to a desirable outcome. So our belief was that we are going to facilitate, right? We are going to educate and be educated. And we are going to translate. We're going to make sure that the language that we use is accessible. And so I think that there is an imperative for the city to show up at visioning tables between developers and between community members to be a part of that process. And it's not always, in my experience, it hasn't always been, a pretty process. There is, it's been some, in many instances, a contentious process, but also productive. And so what does the requirement and the imperative look like on the side of the public sector to show up to the community that they serve and represent, right? And how do they show up, right? What you are stating is a problem that we've run into a lot, even as residents will organize themselves and come up with visions for the community that the public sector doesn't agree with. Like how do the two connect? It's a recurring issue. Trying to figure out the best strategy to get public sector officials to show up is still something that we're grappling with. But for us, it was numbers. We had numbers, right? And when you have numbers and when you have a community, everybody speaking that same language, they have to listen. And so that's how we did it. In many instances we were successful. Some were not. Right. But, we're still learning. But yeah, that's hard. That's hard. That's a great question, Tanya. Claire, did you want to add anything to
that? No, it just sounds like is the breakdown that the government hasn't in setting design guidelines and planning guidelines, they haven't really incorporated community in that, and so that's where they start butting heads.
I think it can, no two projects are the same, of course, but I think at some point there's this very strong ideas about what makes a walkable community, for example. And as much as I like walkable communities, there's sometimes competing interests from the residents. It used to be just kind of the debate happened around parking, and now it's everything. It's building placement, it's landscaping, and parking and wanting a walkable community. The residents are like, you ain't building that shopping center in my neighborhood without any parking, because then everyone's going to park in front of my house. So the reality of meeting the required codes versus a strong desire. And let's be real, Detroit, using Detroit as the example, because that's where I do most of my work. It is a city, but much of it is not developed in a traditional urban footprint. I mean, developing Midtown is very different than developing in Northwest Detroit. And so applying that same sort of ideology citywide isn't appropriate. And I feel the tension with the residents that are they're being forced to ascribe to a design philosophy that they resent and don't embrace. And so we try to bring everyone to the table. Orlando, you're so funny. Yeah, numbers. Yeah, when you show up to a public hearing with 50 residents that all have a strong opinion, that says something. But my concern, it being a member of the development community, is all it does is kind of create this adversarial relationship over time. And that is not good for our community. at all. So looking forward as relationship building, what can we do to kind of,
Adversarial with whom? Adversarial relationship with residents or adversarial relationship with the public sector?
I think everybody involved, to be honest with you. Even as a consultant, I think there's probably people on this call that have been in this situation where you can see the city's viewpoint, and you can see the residents' viewpoint, and you see the developer, and the developers is just like, okay, tell me what I need to do. And they've done all their homework. They've talked to the residents. They've adjusted their plans. The site plan development process lasted well over a year with lots of community engagement. And then you would have a city official saying, I don't really like it, so go back to the drawing board. That frustrates the residents, the developer, and certainly the architect. So those are the things I'm encountering, and it's more and more these days, and it's in Grand Rapids and in Detroit. Those are my two contexts for that statement, but I don't know.
Yeah. Sometimes sitting in that conflict and leaning into it is what needs to happen. And I know your practice very well, Tanya. And one of the things that you are good at and that you champion is staying engaged even when the deal is done, right? Oftentimes the relationship is adversarial because it's transactional, right? And so when we talk about engagement, the critique is from a friend of mine in the North End, a resident, date me first before we get engaged. Like, build the relationship and remain engaged. And when conflict and tensions arise, because they know you and they know your heart and they know the desire, understanding can take place, and mutual respect, even though it's tense and even though there's disagreement. Those relationships can remain intact. And I think that, that's the most important thing for those of us doing this work, maintaining that trust. But we got to be consistent in how we show up, and we got to be consistent in our transparency. Let's put it all out there. So thank you for that, Tanya.
I keep thinking too about your Deeds talk a few years ago about how to respectfully enter Black communities and honor residents, and being in right relationship, like you said, Orlando, right? Like outside of work, outside of the transactions is like the big challenge. Why I'm like always asking these questions too. Like, what would that look like if we're at each other's like birthday parties and backyard barbecues before, like years before we ever needed to like be in a community meeting together, talking about our dreams for our built environment in a way that isn't about like something needing to be done next week, but sharing our ideas about why. I mean, I struggle with this, Tanya, because like I have a lot of feelings about cars and the planet and the future of our planet. And I bump into this all the time. I think I fight with like Lauren Hood about it a lot, like about like, parking, because, she's a born and bred Detroiter and she wants to drive around, and I'm like, let's figure out how to do this better kind of person. So she, like, our dialogues help remind me that, my idea of that is too simple, and I need to like listen for why that is. And but like that can happen, those conversations, if they're happening like over a drink or over like, us sharing a meal over time, then, we're like friends talking through it, as opposed to like it being imposed, in a meeting.
That's such a great point. I mean,
high in the sky a little bit.
Yeah, nobody has to assume your intent if they know your heart first, so building that relationship is so incredibly important, and such an important piece of having these conversations. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today and for just opening this space up for
hi, Kate Baker. I just saw you on the screen. So I have to say,
I was in a Detroit City Council meeting. Hi, guys.
Hi,
Thank you so much.
Kate Baker and I came out of the same school, so I have a forever connection to Kate.
Love it. So we are going to open up some space for everyone who's with us to start kind of dialoguing together. We're going to go into breakout rooms. Victoria, are you ready for that? Can you give me a thumbs up or a indication? Perfect.
We're good to go.
Yeah, so we are ready to go into some breakout rooms. What we're going to do, since we've got about 20 minutes left, we're going to do 2 7-minute breakouts, and then we're going to do a very quick 5-minute. The last question is more for future planning than it is for sort of reflection. So we're going to go in and follow the topics. Don't follow the topics if that's not where it leads, but we do have some prompting questions. Claire and Orlando, you are welcome to join in those conversations, or you are, welcome to move along with your day as well. I appreciate either way. So thank you so much. Let's go into the breakout rooms and build more community together.